If ever there was a U-boat that was doomed from the start, it would be U-570. The U-boat had been out of Trondheim in German-occupied Norway a mere 3 days when everything started to go awry. First, the diesel engines were poorly tuned, which created horrible vibrations inside the sub. Second, the air compressor was malfunctioning. Third, the hydrophones or passive listening gear had been knocked out earlier. To make matters worse, nearly the entire crew apart from 4 men were young seamen on their first patrol. Not surprisingly, many of the crew were seasick as a result of the fetid air and horrible vibrations. One crewman would later recount how the vomit was literally flowing, so bad were the conditions on board. The seasickness was literally contagious. As for its first mission, U-570 was set to intercept convoy HX-145 south of Iceland. However, there was no such convoy. Turns out that the Allies had concocted the fake convoy in order to lure a German sub into Icelandic waters in order to capture it. The intent was to hopefully get their hands on Germany's famous deciphering machine, the Enigma. U-570 was literally sailing into a trap. On the day of the attack from above, the sub was wallowing close to the surface due to a handling error by one of the crew. The man in charge of the U-boat, Captain Lieutenant Hans-Joachim Rumlow, was at his wits' end. Not only did he have a sub full of inexperienced seasick crew, but this was his first ever command of a U-boat on patrol. The lack of air search radar on board U-570 is what actually precipitated the entire fiasco. That's because Rumlow and his officers were blissfully unaware that their submarine would be breaking the surface right under an RAF Lockheed Hudson, which had just spotted the vessel and was making a dive for it. Luckily for all on board the U-boat, the release gear on the Lockheed Hudson malfunctioned. This resulted in the 4 Torpex-filled depth charges not detaching from the plane's bomb bay. The Hudson had to pull out of its dive and regain altitude to prepare for a second attack. Down below, Rumlow was able to get his U-boat back under control and glide it back into the water. No one on board the German sub had the faintest clue how close they'd been to getting obliterated by a Lockheed Hudson bomber from directly above. One needs to remember that Rumlow and his crew were not aware of the aborted attempt by the Lockheed Hudson. The submarine surfaced once more, this time more smoothly and as intended. Rumlow was about to open the upper hatch for a lookout. Just then, another Hudson bomber from 269 Squadron spotted the U-boat and went in for the attack. The Hudson deployed 4 depth charges, all of which detonated close to the submarine. The resulting shock waves inside the submarine must have been deafening as the submarine rolled onto its side. A faint whiff of chlorine gas from the sub's batteries could be smelled. The hiss of escaping air filled the U-boat. Panic ensued inside the submarine. The crew of mostly young, inexperienced, and seasick sailors reacted in horror to the noise and smells, not to mention being trapped inside a half-turned vessel. Rumlow, himself inexperienced and overcome with uncertainty and fear, immediately ordered the submarine to surface and instructed his crew to prepare to go topside. The crew in the Hudson bomber were amazed to see the U-boat resurface and its crew filing out onto its deck. The British aircrew were convinced that the Germans were making for the U-boat's anti-aircraft gun. The Hudson released a hail of .303-inch bullets, which splattered against the submarine's deck, injuring 5 of the German crew with superficial wounds. Luckily, most of the bullets missed the submarine. What Rumlow had failed to realize, or didn't care to consider, was that the Hudson had already discharged its full load of depth charges, and so the submarine could not be hit again by the plane. The submarine was still in working order, and Rumlow could have ordered that the U-boat dive to safety. Instead, Rumlow barked an order down the hatch, snatched a large square of white cardboard handed to him by one of his crew, raised his arms to hold it aloft, and made the universal plea for surrender. Other of his crew waved white handkerchiefs and even their shirts up at the passing aircraft. The British crew on board the Hudson were surprised at this quick surrender and assumed the submarine was heavily damaged and could not submerge. They had gotten unbelievably lucky, as it was the first U-boat to surrender to an enemy aircraft. At that time, the scenario had only happened once before in the war. That was when a crippled British mine layer named Seal was forced to surrender to 2 Luftwaffe seaplanes on May 5, 1940, off the coast of Denmark. However, it would transpire that unlike that heavily damaged British mine layer, U-570 was basically undamaged, with all weapons intact. The sub was entirely battle-ready and seaworthy, yet here was Romlo handing over his vessel in abject surrender. The British could not believe their luck as the intact U-boat was towed to Iceland. Grizedale Hall, known as Britain's prisoner of war camp number 1, was situated in the beautiful Lake District of northwestern England. It's where all the naval officers of Germany's Kriegsmarine were being kept as POWs. They were horrified to read about the capture of U-570 in the British newspapers. One of the senior officers, Korvettenkapitän Otto Kretschmer, was especially disgusted. Kretschmer was an icon of the U-boat division, having sunken more than 260,000 tons of Allied shipping, and who had only been taken prisoner because of the destruction of U-99 on the March 17, 1941. He railed angrily at what he believed was a spineless capitulation by the commander of U-570. And so the German officers at Grizedale Hall decided to conduct their own court-martial of the officers of U-570 when those men arrived as prisoners at the Lake District prison. It would be a three-man council chaired by Captain Lieutenant Horst Hesselbarth, who happened to be a lawyer by trade. The German council would ensure that the hearing abided strictly to German military law. There was a very compelling reason why the German officers felt it their duty to conduct the trial, even if they themselves were prisoners of war on enemy territory. One needs to remember that in 1941 the Germans would still have been convinced that they would eventually occupy Great Britain, just as they occupied most of Europe by then. And so the trial would serve a purpose once that supposed eventuality occurred. It's quite obvious that this trial by German POWs was against the rules and would have no standing under English law. Nevertheless, the three-man German trial at Grizedale Hall proceeded. Besides Romlo, it was decided that 3 other men would stand trial before the German council. They would be the second in command, Lieutenant Bernhard Berndt, another lieutenant on board, or Lieutenant zur See Walter Christiansen, and the engineer, Leitender Engineer Erich Menzel. Worth noting is that Commander Romlo was not present at the trial's commencement, as he was still being interrogated by the British in London. The 2 subordinates, Christiansen and Menzel, were interrogated first. It was very quickly decided that the 2 men had played no definitive role in the decision-making on board U-570, and so they were cleared. Attention turned to Bernhard Berndt. Berndt was sworn in with the solemn oath that went like this: "I swear this holy oath by God that I will implicitly obey the leader of the German Reich and people, Adolf Hitler, the supreme commander of the armed forces, and that, as a resolute sailor, I will be willing to stake my life at any time for this oath." What followed was a lengthy exchange between Horst Hesselbarth, as chairman of the German military court, and Berndt. One of the exchanges went as follows after Berndt confirmed that he was very familiar with the code of conduct for U-boat commanders and officers. Hesselbarth: "And with the paragraph which states that a U-boat must never be allowed to fall into enemy hands?" Berndt: "Yes, sir." Hesselbarth: "But no attempt was made to scuttle U-570. Berndt: "No, sir. Captain Lieutenant Romlo gave no orders." Hesselbarth: "But you know the battle instructions. You have just said so. Why did you not put Captain Lieutenant under arrest and take command of the submarine yourself?" That seems a rather ridiculous and totally unrealistic question to ask Berndt. How could he have placed his commander under arrest under those circumstances and in front of an inexperienced crew that was already stressed out and under attack? Berndt chose to remain silent on that question. Further cross-examination established that U-570 was indeed undamaged and could have easily dived and escaped. What also transpired is that Berndt was quickly becoming responsible for what had been his captain's inexplicable behavior. For example, Berndt was asked why the submarine wasn't, at the very least, scuttled so that it didn't fall into enemy hands. Once again, was that really his choice to make? And where was Romlo in the midst of all this questioning? Oh, that's right, in London, himself being interrogated. It was almost certain that Berndt would be found guilty for cowardice by this ersatz German military court. That could mean the poor man would be sentenced to death. Things took a turn when the POWs received news that the Royal Navy had berthed U-570 at Barrow-in-Furness in Cumbria, northern England. That was a mere 25 miles or 40 kilometers from Grizedale Hall. The officers then strongly suggested that Berndt escape to where the submarine was berthed and sabotage it, thus depriving the British of more access to it. That would restore his honor as a German naval officer. It has even been suggested that Berndt himself offered this solution to redeem his honor. And so, by means of the most ingenious clandestine efforts, Bernhard Berndt was transformed into a Dutch merchant seaman. This guise would help explain his heavily accented English. If caught, his cover story was that he had gotten drunk after a wild night in Blackpool and had gone in the wrong direction in his effort to rejoin his ship in Liverpool. And so it was that a few evenings later the Germans had a raucous sing-along party so that Berndt could wriggle in cover of darkness through a hole in the barbed wire and make his way. The plan worked. Well, at least for 2 miles it did. Unfortunately for Berndt, a British civilian Home Guard patrol stopped him. He gave them his cover story and false papers, which they accepted as valid. They just needed to take him to nearby Grisdale Hall to complete identification. Berndt freaked out, knowing he'd be found out once back there, and so made a dash for it. The British patrolman shouted out for him to stop, but he kept running. It took one single bullet to bring down and kill Bernhard Berndt. Ironically, the man condemned as a coward by his fellow Germans just a few days earlier would be buried 3 days later as a hero, with 12 U-boat officers at his funeral. The British were so impressed by what Berndt had tried to do to clear his name that they draped a British naval ensign over his coffin. Even more ironically, Hans Joachim Ramlow finally arrived at Grisdale Hall on the day of the funeral, but he was spared any similar trial by his fellow German officers, since by then the British had put a stop to any such proceedings at the prison. And so it was that Ramlow was never put on trial or made to explain why he surrendered his U-boat so quickly. He certainly didn't seem to be the leader for the occasion. Years later, it would come out that Ramlow had in fact spent 6 months during 1939 in a military mental hospital before being commissioned as a U-boat commander. That may explain how he succumbed under extreme pressure aboard U-570 on that day. U-570 was refurbished into a British submarine named HMS Graf on October 5, 1941, just 5 weeks after it was captured from the Germans. It would serve for less than 2 years, eventually running aground on the west coast of Islay, Scotland in March 1944. It was on its way to being scrapped. The wreckage of what was U-570 would break up in 1961. In the end, U-570 was the only U-boat that served both the German and Allied navies during World War II. The way it was captured and the way it disappeared do suggest one thing: it was a doomed submarine from the very start.